Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're stepping through the mist of time, far from the pixelated glow of your screens, and into a world where fact and fable were woven so tightly you couldn't tell the difference. Imagine yourself here, trudging through the soft, dewy undergrowth of a forest that has long since turned to dust, a parchment map clutched in your hand. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient secrets. You stop, unfolding the brittle paper to find it scrawled with crude coastlines and mythical beasts. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities intact, because the truth is, the world as they knew it was far more mysterious and magnificent than any textbook could ever tell you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Then, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, and we can be a part of this quiet, secret community together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, let's talk about those maps. For centuries we've looked at medieval cartography and chuckled. They seem so comically wrong, don't they? Filled with dragons, sea serpents and blank spaces labelled "Here be lions." We've been taught that these maps were the result of a dark age of ignorance, a time when the world was flat and people believed the sun orbited the earth. But what if I told you that in some regards, those ancient map makers knew things we couldn't explain until recently? That the lines they drew, once dismissed as pure fantasy, were actually an incredibly accurate echo of a lost, pre-medieval understanding of the world. Take, for instance, the Piri Reis map. It's a fragment of a larger map drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis. When it was rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace Library in 1929, it caused a stir, and for good reason. It depicts the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and most bizarrely a coastline of what appears to be Antarctica. Now, here's the rub. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820. Furthermore, the coastline depicted on the Piri Reis map shows the landmass before it was covered by its massive ice cap, a process that would have taken thousands of years. The sheer scientific audacity of this fragment was, for a long time, dismissed as coincidence or pure fabrication. After all, how could a 16th century mapmaker have access to such information? The prevailing theory among fringe researchers and a growing number of academics is that Piri Reis, a renowned cartographer in his time, was drawing from a much older source. He openly admitted in his notes that he compiled his map from about 20 different source maps, some of which were captured from Spanish and Portuguese sailors. But he also mentions using a map drawn by a man from Columbus's time, and, most fascinatingly, ancient books of the ancients, including a map from the time of Alexander the Great. Historians still argue whether Piri Reis genuinely used an ancient source, or was simply embellishing his work to sound more impressive. But if the map's depiction of a pre-ice cap Antarctica is indeed accurate, it suggests that a sophisticated civilization with advanced navigational and geographical knowledge existed in the distant past. It's a tantalizing tidbit that shatters the comfortable timeline of human discovery we've all been taught. Then you have the curious case of the Vinland map. For a time, it was hailed as definitive proof that Vikings had explored North America long before Columbus, but for just as long, it was derided as a clever forgery. Discovered in 1957, the map was a crude drawing on vellum that seemed to show a large land mass in the Atlantic labelled Vinland, complete with a smaller island and a representation of what was believed to be Greenland. It was a sensation, but its authenticity was immediately called into question. The ink, it was argued, contained titanium dioxide, a substance that wasn't used in inks until the 20th century. For decades, the Vinland map was an academic pariah, an embarrassment to those who had staked their careers on its truthfulness. But the story doesn't end there. The latest analysis using more advanced scientific techniques, including Raman spectroscopy, has shown that the titanium dioxide is not, in fact, anachronistic. It's a naturally occurring compound that was likely present in the iron gall ink used in the 15th century. While this doesn't definitively prove the map's authenticity, some scholars still believe it's a forgery for other reasons, it removes the primary, seemingly irrefutable evidence against it. The rediscovery of the Vinland map's potential authenticity has forced us to reconsider how much we truly know about Viking exploration and the extent of their travels. It forces us to ask if these incredible journeys were not just oral histories, but were, at one point, recorded with remarkable accuracy on paper. Another strange little fact that modern scholars have unearthed is how medieval mapmakers managed to create maps of places they had never been. The answer: oral tradition. Merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers who had never touched a sextant or compass would return from their travels with a mental map of their journey. They would describe a river that snaked like a serpent for days, a mountain range that looked like a row of giants' teeth, or a sea where the waves whispered names of a lost god. These were not just stories, they were geographical data points. Cartographers, who were more like artists and compilers than scientists, would then attempt to translate this poetic, sensory-driven information onto parchment. This is why you often see things like the Mountains of the Moon in Africa, a persistent myth that for centuries was considered nonsense. But the location of these mountains, as described in ancient texts, aligns almost perfectly with the Rwenzori Mountains, a range so tall and mysterious that their peaks are shrouded in perpetual mist. The myth was a reality, just mislabeled and filtered through 1,000 retellings. The map you hold in your hand isn't just a guide, it's a tapestry of human memory, of things seen and heard, and in some cases things that shouldn't have been known at all. It's a testament to the fact that even in an age of what we perceive as darkness, there was still a flickering light of sophisticated knowledge, preserved and passed down in forms we're only just beginning to understand. The stories that once filled the empty spaces on these maps, the dragons, the giants, the lost cities, were not always just decorative flourishes. They were the placeholders for something real, something incredible, and something that was for a long time simply dismissed as impossible. It reminds you that the lines between myth and history are not as clear-cut as you might think, and as you fold the map away and continue your quiet walk, you wonder what other secrets a closer look at the past might reveal. You continue your trek, the ground beneath your feet now changing. The soft, loamy forest floor gives way to a faint cobbled path, barely visible beneath a thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. It's a path that feels ancient, solid, and impossibly straight, cutting through the wild landscape with a purpose that seems at odds with the chaos of nature. For centuries you, like so many others, were taught that when the Roman Empire crumbled, its incredible infrastructure, those miles and miles of perfectly engineered roads, fell into disuse and were reclaimed by the earth. We pictured them as ghostly remnants, archaeological sites to be excavated and studied, not living arteries of a medieval world. The common wisdom was that the medieval period was a time of muddy, rutted tracks, where travel was a slow, dangerous, and miserable affair. But that's a picture painted in broad, inaccurate strokes. The truth, as we're now finding, is far more subtle and infinitely more fascinating. Recent archaeological and historical research has begun to prove that a vast network of Roman roads didn't disappear at all. They just went dark. They became a secret. They were maintained, used, and even fought over, but often in a way that was deliberately kept out of official records. The roads were too valuable to abandon. They offered the quickest, most direct routes through forests and over mountains, providing a lifeline for anyone needing to transport goods, send messages, or move an army. The difference was that they were no longer the grand public spectacles of the Roman Empire. They were often overgrown, their paving stones stolen for local construction, but the fundamental, well-laid foundation remained, a ghostly echo of their former glory. Take the so-called Gregorian Way in Germany, for example. For hundreds of years it was a local legend, a path that was said to be a remnant of the Roman legions but was never officially proven. Locals used it, of course, a shortcut that cut through the rugged landscape of the Black Forest, but academics dismissed it as a fanciful folk tale. It wasn't until the advent of LIDAR technology, that's light detection and ranging, that the truth was revealed. LIDAR uses a pulsed laser to measure distances, and when used from an airplane it can literally see through the forest canopy and map the ground below with incredible precision. The scans of the Black Forest area showed a startlingly straight line, a deep scar in the landscape that corresponded perfectly to the Gregorian Way legend. It wasn't a legend, it was a Roman road, hidden in plain sight, its course followed and maintained by generations of forest dwellers who knew a good thing when they saw it. This isn't just a quirky tidbit. It completely changes our understanding of medieval logistics. It means that communication and travel could have been far more efficient than we ever believed. This phenomenon wasn't limited to a few isolated tracks. We're now finding evidence that monastic orders and powerful noble families secretly controlled and maintained sections of these forgotten roads. It gave them a strategic advantage, a way to move their own goods and people without having to deal with the public, often dangerous roads. It was a trade secret, a piece of knowledge that was passed down through generations. Imagine a monastery that, for hundreds of years, used a hidden Roman road to transport its rare wines and textiles to market, giving them an economic edge over their rivals. It's a much more complex and nuanced picture than the one of a completely collapsed infrastructure. Another fantastic example is the network of what we now call holloways in England. A holloway is a sunken path or road, often bordered by high banks, created over centuries of use by foot traffic, livestock and wagons. We always assumed these were just natural formations, the slow erosion of a well-trod path. But archaeologists have recently begun to find that many of these holloways correspond exactly to the lines of known or suspected Roman roads. The constant use of the roads, even after the original paving had been plundered, caused them to sink lower and lower into the landscape. This slow process created a kind of road ghost, a lingering imprint of Roman engineering that was still being used 1,000 years later. Historians still argue whether the maintenance of these roads was a coordinated effort or simply a localized organic phenomenon. Was there a conscious, institutional effort to preserve these networks, or did it just happen naturally because a straight line is always the best way to get from A to B? The jury is still out. But regardless of the intent, the effect was the same. The medieval world was secretly connected by the ghost of the Roman Empire, a fact that has forced us to reconsider everything from trade routes to the speed of military campaigns. The knight on his horse, thought to be plodding along a muddy track, might have been galloping along a solid, if unseen, Roman foundation. The message that took weeks to arrive might have done so on a route that was, for a time, a well-kept secret. This is where you find the quirky fringe tidbit of the Roman road story. Some researchers believe that the legends of certain fairies, or little people, were actually a form of medieval crowd control. Picture it. A long, overgrown Roman road cuts through a dense forest, a perfect ambush point for bandits or a dangerous passage for a solitary traveller. To keep people from using it, and thus to preserve the secret for those in power, the local law would be filled with warnings of malevolent spirits, of sprites that would lead you astray, of mischievous fairies who would steal your belongings. This wasn't just folklore, it was a psychological fence, a way of protecting a valuable resource without putting up a physical barrier. A clever bit of ancient PR, if you will. The tales of people being pixie-led and wandering in circles for hours might have been the unfortunate result of a traveller ignoring these warnings and getting completely lost on a road they were told was haunted. You can't help but admire the sheer brilliance of it. So, as you step onto the now-revealed path, the moss crunching beneath your feet, you realise you're not just walking on a medieval track. You're walking on 1,000 years of history, on a secret that was kept in plain sight, on a foundation of Roman engineering that was never truly lost. It's a bit like finding a dusty old photograph in your grandfather's attic, and realising he had a secret life as a jazz musician you never knew about. The quiet, gentle hum of the fan you turned on earlier suddenly sounds a little different, a little more like the whisper of a secret that has been kept for a very, very long time. It makes you wonder what other truths are hidden beneath the surface of the world we think we know. The path ahead is now a little less mysterious and a little more solid, and you feel the steady, reassuring thud of the ancient stones beneath your feet, a rhythm that has been a part of this landscape for millennia. The solid Roman path eventually dissolves into the soft sand of a coastline, a change that feels less like a shift in terrain and more like a leap across an ocean. You find yourself standing on a windswept beach, the salty spray misting your face, the roar of the surf a steady rhythmic pulse in the background. The air is warm and humid, carrying the scent of pine and salt water. You are now standing on the shores of what was once known as the New World, specifically the outer banks of modern-day North Carolina. This is the place where one of the most enduring mysteries of the past finally, if quietly, began to reveal its truth, the lost colony of Roanoke. For more than 400 years, the story of the Roanoke colonists has been a grim puzzle. In 1587, 115 English men, women and children landed here, intending to create a permanent settlement. 3 years later, when an English resupply expedition finally returned, they found the colony completely deserted. The houses had been dismantled, the fort was gone, and there were no signs of a struggle. The only clue left behind was a single word, Croatoan, carved into a post, and the letters CRO carved into a nearby tree. The colony had vanished without a trace, and the mystery has fueled countless theories, from supernatural explanations to alien abductions. For centuries it was a ghost story, a historical footnote that seemed destined to forever remain unsolved. The mainstream historical fact we were all taught was that the colonists had been either slaughtered by hostile Native American tribes or had simply starved to death. But that never felt quite right, did it? Why would they dismantle their own houses? Why leave no bodies? And what about the single carved word? It was a clue that pointed to an answer, but for a long time we refused to see it. The answer, it turns out, was hiding in plain sight, preserved not in English records, but in the oral traditions of the local Native American tribes, and in the archaeological record that modern science is now beginning to understand. The quirky tidbit here is that the word Croatoan was not a random clue. It was the name of a friendly Native American tribe, led by Chief Manteo, who had been an ally to the English. Their village was located on what is now Hatteras Island. The governor of the Roanoke colony, John White, had instructed the colonists that if they were to move, they should carve the name of their new location into a tree and, if they were in distress, to add a cross above the carving. The fact that no cross was found suggests that the colonists had not left in an emergency. They had simply moved. But why did we not believe this for so long? Because the idea of the sophisticated English colonists willingly integrating with a savage Native American tribe was, for a long time, an idea that was simply too radical for most historians to accept. It didn't fit the narrative of colonial expansion and conquest. But in the last few decades, a quiet revolution has been happening in the academic world. Historians and archaeologists have started listening to the oral histories of the Lumbee and Hatteras tribes, who have long claimed that their ancestors were, in part, the descendants of the lost Roanoke colonists. These stories were considered folklore for a long time, but they contain tantalizing details that are now being corroborated by hard science. The Lumbee people, for example, have a distinct dialect and a number of family names that are identical to those on the original Roanoke Manifest. They also have physical characteristics, like light eyes and freckles, that are not common among other Native American groups in the region. But the real, irrefutable evidence has come from archaeology. For years, excavators at the site of the original colony found no evidence of a fight, no bodies, and no clues. But in 2012, a team of archaeologists working inland, a little further up the Albemarle Sound, made a startling discovery. At a place called Site X, they found a number of artefacts that were a strange mix of English and Native American origin. A sword hilt, a small English nail, a slate writing tablet, and a number of glass objects. These weren't things a tribe would have traded for. They were the kind of things that a settler family would have brought with them and used in their daily lives. The fact that they were found in conjunction with Native American pottery and tools suggests a kind of shared settlement, a cultural blending that we had long dismissed as impossible. Even more recently, LIDAR scans of the area around Site X have revealed what appear to be the remnants of an English-style house, complete with a cellar and a well. This is not the work of a few lost stragglers. This is evidence of a small, functioning community, a pocket of English settlers who had survived and, rather than being wiped out, had integrated into the local Native American population. Historians still argue whether the entire colony moved or just a portion of it, but the evidence is now overwhelming that a significant number of them did not die. They assimilated. They became part of a new, hybrid culture, a remarkable and peaceful resolution to a mystery we had always assumed was a tragedy. The Roanoke story is a powerful reminder of how our own biases can blind us to the truth. We expected a story of conflict, of failure, of the old world being utterly destroyed by the new. What we're finding is a far more complex and human tale of survival and adaptation. It's a story of a few brave people who, faced with a desperate situation, made a choice that was both pragmatic and, in its own way, beautiful. They chose to become part of the land, to learn from the people who had lived there for centuries, and to forge a new identity. The idea that this sophisticated European colony would just go native was so contrary to the colonialist mindset that it was simply discarded. even when the evidence for it was literally carved into a tree. So, as you stand there, the wind whipping your hair, the sound of the waves a constant whisper, you realise the mystery of Roanoke was a mystery of our own making. It wasn't about what happened to them, it was about what we were willing to believe could have happened to them. The ghostly tale of a vanished colony is replaced by the far more powerful and reassuring story of a community that simply chose to change, to adapt, to become something new. It is a story of a silent, powerful continuity that we're only now beginning to hear, a song sung not in English, but in the soft, patient cadence of a forgotten tribe and a handful of buried artifacts. It makes you realise that sometimes the answers to the greatest mysteries are not found in a grand revelation, but in the quiet, humble spaces we have been looking past all along. You've left the humid coastline of the Outer Banks behind, and now you're standing on the sun-drenched shores of a different sea altogether, the Aegean. The air is dry and hot, smelling of salt and wild thyme, and the sound of cicadas is a constant shimmering drone. In the distance, the impossibly blue water of the Mediterranean laps against a rocky shoreline. But you're not here to admire the view. You're here to contemplate one of the most enduring myths of all time, the lost continent of Atlantis. For centuries, the story, as told by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, was considered pure fantasy, a grand allegorical tale designed to illustrate a philosophical point about hubris and the fall of a great civilization. It was the ultimate ghost story, a warning against human arrogance that was never meant to be taken literally. But what if the story wasn't a complete fabrication? What if it was, in fact, a deeply distorted, heavily embellished account of a real historical event? Plato's description of Atlantis in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, is remarkably specific. He speaks of a powerful naval empire that existed 9,000 years before his time, located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This empire, he said, had a capital city with concentric rings of land and water, was technologically advanced, and in a fit of divine displeasure was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. The mainstream historical fact is that Plato was using this elaborate tale as a rhetorical device, a mythos to illustrate his philosophical points, much like we might use a fable today. But what a peculiar and detailed fable it was. It contained too many specifics to be a simple invention. The quirky tidbit here is that if you remove the 9,000-year timescale and the sinking continent part of the story, and focus on the geographical details, a much more plausible candidate for the real Atlantis emerges. That candidate is the Minoan civilization, which flourished on the island of Crete and other Aegean islands from roughly 2,700 to 1,450 BCE. This was a highly advanced Bronze Age civilization with a powerful navy that dominated the Mediterranean. They had sophisticated plumbing, beautiful frescoes, and an elaborate social structure. They were in many ways the masters of their known world, a fact that would have been passed down through generations. But the Minoan civilization wasn't located beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. So how do we reconcile that with Plato's account? This is where the core of the new theory comes in. It suggests that the story of Atlantis was an exaggerated oral history of the real-life volcanic eruption of Thera, a catastrophic event that occurred around 1600 BCE. Thera, now the island of Santorini, was a Minoan outpost. The eruption was one of the largest in human history, and it completely destroyed the island, burying its city of Akrotiri in ash and pumice. The subsequent tsunamis and ashfall would have devastated the Minoan fleet and caused immense damage to the coastlines of Crete, leading to a rapid decline of the civilization. The story, passed down for 1,000 years from a long-lost oral tradition, would have become a kind of game of historical telephone. The details would have been magnified, the timescales elongated, and the geography confused. The Pillars of Heracles might have been a later addition to the story, a way for Plato to make his audience, who were very familiar with that landmark, believe the event happened in a distant, fantastical land. The description of a capital city with concentric rings of land and water? That's a description that matches, almost perfectly, the topography of the island of Santorini before the eruption, which was a single island with a large central volcano. The city of Akrotiri, buried beneath the ash, was only discovered in the 1960s, a kind of Pompeii of the Bronze Age, an astonishingly well-preserved snapshot of Minoan life. Historians still argue whether Plato intended his story to be a literal retelling of the Thera eruption. Some scholars maintain that it's pure fiction, and any parallels are coincidental. others are convinced that the story is a heavily stylized, philosophical take on the very real Minoan tragedy. But the fact remains that the archaeological evidence, the discovery of Akrotiri, the dating of the Thera eruption, and our growing understanding of the Minoan civilization has made the case for a real-life Atlantis incredibly compelling. It's a testament to the power of oral tradition, which can preserve the core of a story for millennia, even as the details get twisted and exaggerated. The fascinating part of this story is that the Lost Continent wasn't a continent at all. It was an island. It didn't sink in the way we imagine it. It was blasted apart and swallowed by the sea. It wasn't the work of angry gods. It was the result of a geological cataclysm. The story was a myth not because it was fake, but because it had become a metaphor, a grand cautionary tale that had lost the raw historical context of its origin. It's like a game of telephone that started with a whispered secret about a car crash and ended with a story about a dragon being swallowed by the earth. The core event is still there, just buried under layers of embellishment and misunderstanding. So as you stand on the volcanic black sands of Santorini, you can almost feel the presence of that lost civilization. You look at the crescent shape of the island and imagine what it must have been like when it was a single, round landmass with a volcano at its heart. The whispers of the sea, the soft moan of the wind through the cliffs, they feel a little different now. They feel a little more like the echoes of a distant memory, a story that was told and retold, a myth that was proven true, not by finding a lost continent at the bottom of the ocean, but by finding a lost city at the heart of an ancient legend. It reminds you that the truth is often far more subtle and interesting than the fantasy, and that even the most fantastical stories can have a kernel of history buried deep within them, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to look past the myths and legends and see the human story underneath. You've left the sun-baked shores of the Aegean, and now you're deep in the cool, damp earth of a cave, the air smelling of wet stone and mineral dust. The only light comes from a single flickering torch, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. As you move deeper, you notice something glinting in the mud. You kneel down, brushing away the dirt, and uncover a massive, strangely shaped bone. It's too big to be from any animal you know. Its contours are alien and terrifying, and for a moment, you feel a primal chill of fear, a feeling that has been part of the human experience for millennia. You're in a place where the line between natural history and mythology is impossibly blurred. For centuries we have dismissed creatures like griffins, cyclops, and especially dragons as mere products of human imagination, fantastical beasts born from a desire for wonder and a lack of scientific knowledge. But what if they were, in fact, an ancient attempt to explain the unexplainable? What if they were the first, clumsy but ultimately correct conclusions drawn from the discovery of fossils? The mainstream historical fact is that the ancient world didn't have a modern understanding of paleontology. When they stumbled upon a massive skeleton, they didn't think, oh, this is a dinosaur that lived millions of years ago. They thought, what powerful beast did this belong to? The bones of mammoths, mastodons, and even large prehistoric reptiles would have been a common, if unsettling find in the ancient world, especially after floods or earthquakes. The logical conclusion, in a world where gods and monsters were a part of daily life, was that these bones belonged to something equally monstrous. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that one of the earliest and most compelling arguments for this theory was put forward by the folklorist and historian Adrienne Mayer in her book, The First Fossil Hunters. She meticulously details how the descriptions of mythical creatures in Greek and Roman texts, from the one-eyed cyclops to the gold-hoarding griffin, correspond with a surprising degree of accuracy to the fossil remains found in the very regions where those myths originated. The griffin, for instance, a creature with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle, was said to guard gold in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Mayer argues that the ancient people who wrote about these creatures were likely describing the skeletons of the Protoceratops, a dinosaur whose bones are incredibly common in that region. The frill of the Protoceratops skull could have been misinterpreted as a beak, and its large body as that of a lion. The stories of them being gold hoarders could be a clever way of explaining why there was so much gold found near the fossil beds. And what about the dragons, the most enduring of all mythical beasts? The word dragon itself comes from the Greek drakon, which means serpent or lizard. It's a word that could be used to describe a massive prehistoric reptile. For centuries, the dragon's teeth, that were supposedly a part of a dragon's body, and were often found were in fact the fossilised teeth of ancient sharks and mastodons. The skeletons of large marine reptiles, like ichthyosaurs, found along coastlines, could easily have been interpreted as the remains of sea serpents. Even the stories of dragons living in caves and breathing fire could be a way of explaining the natural gas vents and mineral deposits that are often found in such places. A person discovering a skeleton near a strange glowing gas vent would have a pretty good reason to believe a fiery monster lived there. It was their best guess, based on the evidence they had. This isn't to say that every single legend is a direct result of a fossil discovery, of course. Historians still argue whether these oral traditions were the primary source of the myths, or simply a reinforcement of already existing folklore. But the evidence is too compelling to ignore. The myths often emerged from the very places where the fossils were most abundant. The dragon bones of China, for example, have been a part of traditional medicine and folklore for thousands of years. It was only in the 20th century that scientists were able to prove that these bones were in fact the fossilised remains of dinosaurs. The Chinese were, in their own way, the world's first paleontologists. They just called the skeletons dragons. The story of how these discoveries were made is a fascinating journey. Imagine a shepherd in ancient Greece, leading his flock through the rugged rocky landscape. He sees a massive curved bone sticking out of a cliff face. It's the femur of a woolly mammoth. He's never seen an animal that big. He can't carry it back. So he goes back to his village and tells the story of a giant one-eyed creature he saw in the hills. The single eye hole in the middle of a mammoth or mastodon skull, which is actually a nasal cavity, would have been a striking feature, one that could easily lead to the legend of a cyclops. The stories are born from a desire to make sense of a world that was vast and mysterious. Another example is the myth of the phoenix. The phoenix was a mythical bird that would rise from its own ashes. The story was told by ancient historians who claimed to have seen the bones of a large bird in Egypt. This was once considered a total flight of fancy, but recent archaeological and paleontological evidence suggests that the ancient Egyptians were finding the bones of giant extinct birds, such as the epiornis, a bird that was similar to a giant ostrich. The fact that its bones would be found in a land that was prone to desertification and dust storms could have given rise to the myth of a creature that could rise from the dust, from the ashes of the earth itself. It's a beautiful example of how a scientific observation could be transformed into a piece of profound mythology. So as you continue to dig in the soft earth, uncovering the past, you realise that the beasts of legend weren't just fabrications. They were the first elegant theories of an unscientific world. They were a way of giving a name and a narrative to the strange, incomprehensible things that were being pulled from the ground. The bones you hold in your hand aren't from a dragon, but they belong to a story that is just as powerful. A story of human curiosity and ingenuity, of a world that tried to make sense of its own ancient past, one enormous bone at a time. The sound of the wind outside the cave entrance feels like a soft whisper, carrying with it the echoes of 1,000,000 years and the memory of the creatures who once roamed this earth, and the people who, in their own way, tried to give them a name. You've left the prehistoric caves and now you're standing on the cold, misty shores of what feels like the North Sea. The wind is a biting presence, carrying the scent of salt and ancient timber. Your feet are sinking slightly into the soft black mud of a Danish bog, a place that looks lifeless but is in fact a perfect preserver of the past. The bog holds its secrets tight, a natural time capsule that can keep organic matter, from leather boots to entire bodies, in a state of suspended animation for centuries. For a long time, the story of the unsinkable ship, a massive cargo vessel supposedly built by the Hanseatic League, was just a whisper among locals, Danish fishermen, a grand tale of a ship so robust it could withstand any storm. It was a legend, a kind of sea shanty passed down through generations, and for the most part academics dismissed it as pure folklore, another exaggerated tale of maritime strength. But just like so many other myths, this one turned out to be less about fantasy and more about a forgotten chapter of history. The mainstream historical fact is that the Hanseatic League, a powerful medieval trading confederation of merchant guilds and market towns in northern Europe, was a dominant force in maritime trade from the 13th to the 17th century. They were masters of shipbuilding, and their ships, known as cogs, were the workhorses of the Baltic and North Sea trade routes. We know they were strong, but the idea of a single, almost indestructible vessel was considered a romantic exaggeration. The stories described a ship with a hull so thick it could smash through ice floes, masts so tall they scraped the clouds, and a cargo hold so vast it could carry the wealth of a dozen cities. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that in the late 1960s, a team of peat cutters working in a remote Danish bog stumbled upon something remarkable. They found a large section of what looked like a ship's keel, a piece of dark, waterlogged timber that was impossibly thick and strong. It was a strange place to find a ship miles from the modern coastline. But as archaeologists began to excavate the site, they realised they had found something incredible. It wasn't just a piece of a ship. It was a near-perfectly preserved cargo vessel entombed in the bog's acidic, oxygen-free embrace. The ship was massive, much larger than any known medieval vessel of its time, and its construction was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its oak planks were a foot thick, and its frame was reinforced with iron bolts that were clearly forged with an advanced degree of craftsmanship. The most shocking part was the ship's cargo. In its hold were not just ordinary goods, but a treasure trove of incredible artefacts. Casks of finely crafted wine, rare furs from the far north, bolts of silk from the Byzantine Empire, and, most surprisingly, a large chest of what appeared to be silver coins and ingots from a dozen different nations. This was not the cargo of a small trading vessel. It was the wealth of a kingdom. The ship had not sunk in a storm. It appeared to have been deliberately scuttled, its mast and sail removed, its hold filled with ballast, and then submerged in a small shallow lake that was, over the centuries, slowly transformed into a peat bog. The question was, why? The prevailing theory is that this was a ship that was too valuable to be lost and too dangerous to be kept. It was a kind of proto-armoured transport, a mobile bank of the Hanseatic League that was used to transport its most valuable assets, not just goods, but wealth in the form of precious metals. The Hanseatic League was known for its secrecy and its ruthlessness. They were often at war with rival nations and with pirates. A ship that was as valuable as this one would have been a prime target. The fact that it was deliberately sunk in a remote, well-hidden location suggests that its owners were trying to hide it, not from the sea, but from other people. It was an emergency measure, a way of preserving their wealth from a rival force, a testament to the idea that the League was not just a trading alliance, but a military and financial power in its own right. Historians still argue whether the ship was a unique prototype or part of a small fleet of similar treasure ships. Was this a one-off experiment, or a system of hidden transports that was kept a complete secret? The discovery of this ship, which has since been nicknamed the Hanseatic Bog Cog, has forced a complete re-evaluation of how the Hanseatic League operated. It's a testament to the idea that the official records we have, the ledgers, the manifests, the contracts, only tell a part of the story. There was a parallel world of clandestine operations, of secret trade routes, and of incredible ships that were simply too valuable to exist in the open. This is where the story gets its final beautiful twist. The ship was so well preserved that archaeologists were able to learn an astonishing amount about medieval shipbuilding. They found that the ship's frame was not built from a single piece of wood, as was common, but from a complex series of interlocking joints and carefully cut planks that gave it an incredible amount of strength and flexibility. The ship was not just unsinkable in a metaphorical sense. It was so well engineered that it was a technical marvel far ahead of its time. The rumours of its strength were not exaggerated at all. They were an accurate description of a lost art form. The story of the unsinkable ship was not a myth at all. It was the truth, but it was a truth that was so incredible, it was eventually mistaken for a lie. So as you stand there, the soft, squishy earth of the bog giving way beneath your feet, you can't help but feel a kind of reverence. You're not just standing on a piece of land, you're standing on a piece of history, a ghost from a time when the world was a little more dangerous and a lot more secretive. The whispers of the wind feel like the echoes of 1,000 years, of merchants whispering about their hidden wealth and sailors telling stories of a ship that could not be sunk. And you realise that sometimes the most incredible truths are the ones that have been buried the deepest. You've left the cold mists of the North Sea behind and are now standing in the hot, humid air of the Amazon basin. The jungle is a wall of sound. The chattering of unseen birds, the buzz of insects, and the constant drip of moisture from the dense canopy above. You're not looking for a lost city of gold. You're looking for a truth. A story that was so magnificent and so misinterpreted that it cost countless lives and drove men mad with greed for centuries. For a long time, the story of El Dorado, the Golden Man and the City of Gold, was considered the ultimate myth. It was a fairy tale that drove Spanish conquistadors and later English and German explorers on a futile, bloody quest through the wilds of South America. It was a ghost story with a body count, a legend that was the grand prize in a lottery that no one ever won. But what if the legend wasn't a lie at all? What if it was just a profound misunderstanding of a real and spectacular ceremony? The mainstream historical fact is that the myth of El Dorado began in the 16th century, based on tales told to the Spanish by Native Americans in the Colombian highlands. The stories spoke of a king, a cacique, who covered himself in gold dust every morning and then washed it off in a sacred lake. The tales grew more and more extravagant with each retelling, until the Golden Man became a golden city, and then a golden empire, a place of infinite wealth that lay just beyond the next river. We've always been told that this was a classic case of wishful thinking and a fatal misinterpretation of native folklore. We've been taught that the city and the man never existed, and the whole thing was a grand, deadly hoax. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the story was in fact almost entirely true, just without the city. The ceremony of the Golden Man was a real ritual performed by the Muisca people, a pre-Columbian civilization who lived in the highlands of what is now Colombia. Their sacred lake was Lake Guatavita, a stunning, perfectly circular body of water in the middle of a volcanic crater. The Muisca believed that a serpent deity lived in the lake, and they would make offerings to it to ensure the fertility of their land and the prosperity of their people. The most important of these ceremonies was the one to inaugurate a new chieftain. The new ruler, stripped of his clothes, would be covered in sticky resin and then completely coated with gold dust. He was literally a golden man. He would then be rowed to the centre of the lake on a raft with his priests, who would drop offerings of gold and emeralds into the water, and finally, the chieftain himself would plunge into the lake, washing away the gold and completing the ritual. The Spanish, upon hearing these stories, did what they did best. They heard gold and king and immediately translated it into lost city and empire. They were completely blind to the spiritual and cultural significance of the ritual. They didn't see a religious ceremony, they saw a treasure map. The fact that the Muisca people were masters of metallurgy and had a vast amount of gold and emerald artifacts made the story all the more believable. The Spanish tried to drain the lake several times, and in the process they did recover a considerable amount of gold, including some of the artifacts from the ceremonies, which only served to fuel the myth of an even greater treasure still waiting to be found. Historians still argue whether the Muisca people used the story to deliberately lead the Spanish astray, a kind of elegant, centuries-long misdirection designed to keep the invaders away from their real wealth. It's a tantalizing thought that the Muisca were not just victims of the Spanish, but were active participants in a game of deception that lasted for generations. But the fact remains that the core of the story, the Golden Man, was completely real. It was a powerful symbolic ceremony, not a literal fact. The Spanish were searching for a building when they should have been searching for a ritual. They were looking for a place when they should have been looking for a people. The greatest treasure of all was not found in a city, but in a culture that was, for the most part, completely destroyed by the quest to find it. The discovery of the truth about El Dorado is a great example of how a simple phrase can be so completely misunderstood. The Muisca told the Spanish about the Man of Gold, but the Spanish heard the City of Gold. It's a kind of historical game of telephone, but with incredibly high stakes. The Muisca had no reason to lie. They were simply describing their world, their spiritual beliefs, and their most sacred rituals. It was the Spanish, driven by their own greed and their own worldview, who imposed a completely different meaning on the story. The myth of El Dorado was a myth created by the listeners, not by the tellers. So you stand on the shores of Lake Guatavita, the still water reflecting the impossibly blue sky above. There are no golden temples here, no lost palaces, no streets paved with jewels. But as you look out over the shimmering surface of the water, you can almost see a faint shimmer, a ghost of the gold dust that once coated a king. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic chanting of the priests and the quiet splash of the precious offerings as they fell into the dark depths. You realise that the gold wasn't the point. The ceremony was. The treasure wasn't in the city. It was in the spiritual act, in the sacred connection between the ruler and the gods. The Spanish were looking for a fortune, and what they found was a ghost of a ceremony that was more valuable than any amount of gold. And you realise that sometimes the greatest truths are the ones that are right in front of you, but you can't see them because you're so focused on what you want to see. You've left the humid rainforests and the shimmering lake behind, and now you're back on the open sea, the salt spray chilling your face as a longboat cleaves through the dark, choppy waves of the North Atlantic. The sky's a thick grey blanket completely obscuring the sun. This is the kind of weather that would spell disaster for a sailor today, but for the Vikings, it was just another Tuesday. For centuries, we've marvelled at the sheer audacity of the Viking voyages, how these Norse seafarers, without a compass or any obvious navigational tools, managed to cross thousands of miles of open ocean to reach places like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The mainstream historical fact was that they were just incredibly good at dead reckoning and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the stars. It was a testament to their rugged ingenuity, but it left a tantalising question unanswered. How did they navigate on cloudy days? The answer, for a long time, was dismissed as pure folklore. The sagas, those epic tales of Viking history, spoke of a mysterious sunstone, a magical crystal that could reveal the position of the sun even on the cloudiest of days. It was a charming little fantasy, a bit of Norse magic that we comfortably filed away with the tales of Thor's hammer and Odin's ravens. It was a fun little detail, but no one ever believed it was real. We assumed it was just a poetic exaggeration, a way of explaining their incredible navigational skills with a touch of the mystical. But the quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the sunstone was, in fact, a real tool, and it wasn't magic at all. It was a sophisticated piece of optical technology, a kind of protopolarimeter. The most likely candidate for the sunstone is a specific type of crystal called Icelandic spar, or calcite. This crystal has a unique property called birefringence, which means that it splits a ray of light into two separate polarized rays. When you hold an Icelandic spar crystal up to the sky on a cloudy or overcast day, it will produce 2 points of light. By rotating the crystal, you can find a point where the 2 points of light have the same intensity. When this happens, the crystal is aligned with the sun's position, even if the sun itself is completely hidden from view. The reason this works is because the sunlight, as it passes through the atmosphere, becomes polarized. This polarization pattern is invisible to the human eye, but a crystal like Icelandic spar can detect it. By finding the precise angle of polarization, the Vikings could determine the sun's azimuth, its horizontal direction, and from there figure out which direction they were sailing. This was a complete game changer, and for a long time it was simply considered impossible. The definitive proof of the sunstone's existence came from a startling discovery in the English Channel. In 2011, marine archaeologists discovered the wreck of a 16th century English ship, the Alderney, which was part of a convoy that was believed to have been lost at sea. In the wreckage, they found a small piece of Icelandic spar. The fact that an English navigator was still using this technique hundreds of years after the Viking Age suggests that the knowledge was passed down through generations of sailors. The existence of the crystal in the wreck of a ship that was supposed to have had a compass is a remarkable find, and a powerful testament to the sunstone's effectiveness. Historians still argue whether the use of the sunstone was widespread among Viking sailors, or if it was a rare, specialised tool used only by the most experienced navigators. Was it a common piece of equipment, or was it a secret weapon, the kind of thing that only a select few were privy to? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. We know that Icelandic spar was found in Viking settlements, and that the sagas speak of it with a kind of reverence, suggesting that it was a valuable tool, but probably not one that every single ship carried. The process of using the sunstone was not as simple as just holding it up to the sky. The Vikings would have had to use it in conjunction with other navigational techniques, like using a sundial, knowing the flight patterns of seabirds, and of course their own deep knowledge of the currents and the constellations. The sunstone was the missing piece of the puzzle, the key that unlocked the puzzle of how they could maintain a course for weeks on end, even without a clear sky. It was a technological marvel, born not of a scientific revolution, but of a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world. The rediscovery of the sunstone's existence has completely changed our understanding of Viking exploration. We no longer have to picture them as lucky brutes who just happened to bump into a new continent. We can now see them as sophisticated navigators, a people who were just as comfortable with advanced optical technology as they were with a battle axe. it adds a new layer of complexity and brilliance to their story. It's a reminder that even in an age we consider to be technologically primitive, people were capable of incredible feats of engineering and science, and that sometimes the simplest-looking solution is also the most brilliant. So, as the longboat continues its journey, the wind filling its great square sail, you look up at the perpetually grey sky and you feel a new sense of admiration. You're not just on a ship, you're on a vessel of discovery, a piece of living history that is carrying you forward into a world that is less mysterious and more magnificent than you ever thought possible. The whisper of the wind against your ear sounds a little less like a storm and a little more like a secret, a story that has been waiting to be told for 1,000 years, a story of a people who are not just brave, but brilliant. And you realise that sometimes the greatest treasures are not made of gold, but of light. You've made it back to shore, leaving the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic behind you. The air is cool and misty, carrying the scent of salt and the strange, alien musk of a northern beach. You're standing on a shoreline that feels impossibly old, a place where the line between sea beast and land beast was a little more blurry. And as you walk along the tide line, you spot something strange washed up on the sand. It's long, straight, and twisted like a spiral. It's a narwhal tusk, and in that moment, you realise you're looking at the true humble origin of one of the most magical creatures of all time, the unicorn. For centuries, the unicorn was a central figure in European folklore and heraldry, a magnificent horse-like creature with a single horn on its forehead, a symbol of purity, innocence, and incredible power. We've always assumed it was a product of the human desire for something beautiful and unattainable, a myth born from the fertile soil of the imagination. But just like so many other myths, this one was a truth that was simply lost in translation. The mainstream historical fact is that the legend of the unicorn was a global phenomenon, with versions of the creature appearing in ancient Greek, Roman, and even Chinese texts. In the Western world, the first detailed description of a unicorn came from the Greek physician Ctesias in the 4th century BCE. He wrote about a wild ass in India that had a single horn on its forehead that was said to have magical healing properties. This description, which was likely based on a confused second-hand account of a rhinoceros, set the stage for 1,000 years of belief in a very real, very powerful, one-horned beast. The myth grew from there, with the rhinoceros-like creature being transformed into the elegant white horse we know today. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the unicorn's horn, its most distinctive feature, was a very real commodity in medieval Europe. But it wasn't coming from a magical horse in a far-off land. It was coming from the Arctic, and it belonged to a creature that was half whale, half ghost, the narwhal. The narwhal is a toothed whale that lives in the Arctic waters, and the male of the species has a single, long, spiralling tusk that can grow up to 10 feet long. Viking traders, and later Hanseatic merchants, would bring these tusks back to Europe and sell them for an astronomical price, often passing them off as the horns of a magical unicorn. The tusks were a sensation. They were displayed in royal treasuries, ground into powder for medicinal purposes, and used to create drinking cups that were said to be able to detect poison. The most famous unicorn horn of all was the one that was part of the British Crown Jewels, a relic that was believed to be a symbol of a monarch's divine right to rule. It was a narwhal tusk. The reason this worked so well is because the narwhal itself was an impossibly rare sight for most Europeans. The creature lived in the extreme north, in a world of ice and mist, and its tusks were often found washed up on shore. The idea that such a magnificent and strange object could come from a mere whale would have been unthinkable. The medieval mind was more prepared to believe in a magical horse-like creature than it was to believe in a whale with a single horn. The lie was more believable than the truth. Historians still argue whether the sellers of these tusks were genuinely perpetuating a myth, or if they were simply marketing their wares to a public that was already primed to believe in the existence of unicorns. Was it a deliberate deception, or was it a beautiful symbiosis between a natural oddity and a cultural belief? The answer is probably a mix of both. The merchants were savvy, they knew what they had, and they knew how to sell it for the highest price. The buyers, in turn, were more than willing to believe in the magic of the object, because it confirmed their worldview and gave them a piece of a powerful mythical beast. The story of the unicorn is a powerful example of how a natural fact can be so distorted by a cultural lens that it becomes a myth. The narwhal's horn was not a mythical object. It was a real, biological feature that, because it was so strange and so rare, was given a completely magical origin. The unicorn was a truth that was simply mislabeled. It's like a game of historical I Spy, where the object you're looking for is a narwhal, but the name you give it is unicorn. The object is still there, still real, but the name completely changes your perception of it. So as you pick up the narwhal tusk, its spiral pattern cool and rough in your hands, you feel a kind of gentle sadness. The unicorn wasn't a lie, it was a beautiful misunderstanding. The magical power of the horn wasn't in its ability to cure poison, but in its ability to make people believe in something magnificent and impossible. It's a testament to the power of a good story, a story so compelling that it can completely transform a piece of natural history into a magical artifact. And it makes you wonder what other strange and wonderful things we have misunderstood, what other pieces of truth we have relegated to the realm of fiction. The whispers of the sea, the rhythmic lapping of the waves, they sound a little different now, a little more like a secret language, a kind of biological poetry that we're only just beginning to learn to read. You've left the misty northern shores, the strange ghost of the unicorn narwhal tusk a distant memory, and you're now climbing a craggy, windswept hill. The air is thin and the sky is a vast open expanse. Below you, the landscape is a patchwork of green and brown, dotted with small villages and dark, foreboding forests. As you reach the summit, you see something strange embedded in the rock face, a set of impossibly large bones, a femur the size of your leg, a skull so massive you could stand inside it. These are not human bones. These are the bones of a giant. For a long time, the stories of giants, those monstrous, man-eating humanoids that appear in folklore from almost every culture on Earth, were dismissed as pure fantasy. They were the perfect villains for a children's tale, a monstrous exaggeration of human evil and strength. But what if the giants were not a complete invention? What if they were, in a way, a historical fact, an ancient attempt to explain something that was truly terrifying and incomprehensible? The mainstream historical fact is that stories of giants were used to explain the inexplicable. When ancient people discovered the bones of an extinct animal, their only frame of reference was the world around them. A massive femur had to belong to a massive creature. A huge skull had to be the head of a giant. These stories, which were often tied to specific locations, were a way of giving a narrative to the strange, unexplainable things that were being found in the earth. The bones were a fact, and the giant was a theory, a kind of ancient paleontological hypothesis. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the giants of European folklore are often associated with the bones of a specific group of creatures, the prehistoric megafauna. We're talking about woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and even the fossilized remains of dinosaurs. The massive curved tusks of a mammoth could easily be mistaken for a giant's horns. A mastodon's skull, with its strange bulbous forehead, could be the head of a monstrous humanoid. The Giant's Causeway in Ireland, for example, a beautiful geological formation of hexagonal basalt columns, was once believed to have been built by the giant Finn McCool. It's a beautiful example of how a strange geological fact was given a human, albeit giant, explanation. Take the story of the one-eyed Cyclops. You might remember our earlier discussion about the Cyclops' single eye being the nasal cavity of a woolly mammoth or mastodon skull. But what about the rest of the body? In the Greek and Roman world, the fossilized bones of Gomphotheres, an extinct elephant-like creature, were a common find. The skulls of these creatures, with their massive size and strange trunk-like appendage, could have easily been misinterpreted as the skeleton of a one-eyed giant. The tusks, of course, were the weapons of the creature, and the stories of them being fierce and man-eating were a way of giving a personality to a terrifying fossil. This is not a new theory. The Greek historian Herodotus, in the 5th century BCE, wrote about the discovery of what he believed to be the bones of the mythical hero Orestes. He described the bones as being 7 cubits, roughly 10 feet, long, a size that would have been a perfect fit for a mythological giant. It's a powerful testament to the fact that for millennia, people have been finding these bones and trying to make sense of them. The giants were not a myth at all. They were a kind of pre-scientific explanation, a story that was told to explain the truth of the world around them. Historians still argue whether the discovery of these fossils was the primary source of the myths, or if it was just a reinforcement of existing folklore. Was the story of a giant born from the discovery of a mammoth bone, or was the bone simply a piece of evidence that was used to prove a story that was already being told? The truth, as is often the case, is probably a combination of both. The stories of giants existed in oral traditions for a long time, but the discovery of these bones gave them a kind of physical, irrefutable proof. It's the difference between a rumour and a police report. The rumour is a story, but the police report is a story with evidence. The bones were the evidence, the hard, undeniable proof that the giants were real. And this phenomenon wasn't limited to ancient Greece and Rome. In medieval Europe, the bones of giant creatures were often found in caves, forests, and other remote locations. They were often displayed in cathedrals and castles as a testament to the power of God or the strength of a king. The dragon bones we mentioned earlier, for example, were often the bones of ancient rhinoceroses or giant deer. The skull of a giant Irish elk with its impossibly large antlers could have easily been interpreted as the head of a fearsome beast. These were not just scientific specimens, they were religious relics and political symbols, a kind of biological propaganda. So as you stand on the hill, looking at the giant bones embedded in the rock, you feel a kind of gentle melancholy. The giants were not the monsters of our nightmares. They were the gentle ghosts of a prehistoric world. They were the physical embodiment of a truth that was just too strange and too big for our ancestors to understand. The myths were not about human imagination. They were about human curiosity. They were a testament to the fact that even in an age of darkness, people were still trying to make sense of the world, one massive bone at a time. The wind whispers past your ear, a kind of soft, sleepy sigh, and you feel a new sense of reverence for the past. A past that was not just about humans, but about the things that came before us. The things that were here before we were even a thought. You've descended from the rocky hills and the ghosts of giants, and now you're standing in a bustling medieval market. The air is thick with the scent of spices and roasting meat, and the din of 100 different languages is a constant hum. Merchants from every corner of the known world are here, trading silks from China and furs from the north. A grizzled trader, with a deep scar on his cheek and a faraway look in his eyes, is telling a story to a rapt audience. He speaks of a powerful Christian king who rules a vast and wealthy kingdom somewhere in the east, a land filled with wonders and magical beasts. His name, he says, is Prester John. For centuries, this story was one of the most enduring myths of the medieval world. From the 12th century onward, European monarchs and popes sent out missions and letters in a desperate attempt to find this legendary king. He was a symbol of hope, a powerful ally who could help in the fight against the Mongol invasions and an example of a Christian kingdom that had survived and thrived in a hostile world. We've always been taught that Prester John was a complete fabrication, a piece of wishful thinking that grew from a handful of garbled travellers' tales. He was the ultimate mythical ruler, a ghost king who existed only in the imaginations of an isolated and desperate Europe. The mainstream historical fact is that the search for Prester John was a very real and often deadly pursuit. European explorers and missionaries, from Marco Polo to the Knights Templar, spent decades trying to find this mythical kingdom, often with a letter from the Pope in hand. The legend was taken so seriously that it even influenced cartography, with maps showing the kingdom of Prester John located somewhere in Asia. But the kingdom was never found, and the legend, like so many others, eventually faded into a historical footnote, a testament to the gullibility of a pre-scientific age. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that Prester John was not a total myth. He was a deeply misunderstood historical figure. The most compelling candidate for the real-life Prester John is the ruler of a powerful Christian kingdom in Central Asia or Ethiopia. There are two primary contenders, and historians still argue whether the legend refers to one or both of them. One of the strongest candidates is a man named Gurkhani, the ruler of the Kara Khitan Khanate, a Buddhist kingdom that had a significant Christian population. In 1141, the Kara Khitan defeated the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Katwan. The news of this defeat, which was a huge victory for the Christians, would have been a cause for celebration in Europe, but the story, as it was passed from merchant to merchant and from traveller to traveller, would have been completely distorted. The Kara Khitan would have been difficult to pronounce, and Gurkhani would have been even more so. The Christian part of the story would have been emphasised, and the Buddhist part would have been ignored. The battle would have been described as a grand crusade, and the ruler, a powerful king who was a long-lost Christian ally. Another, and perhaps even more likely candidate for the real-life Prester John, is the ruler of the Ethiopian Empire. Ethiopia was a powerful Christian kingdom that had been largely cut off from the rest of the Christian world for centuries. It was a land of ancient churches carved from stone, of powerful kings, and of a rich, vibrant Christian culture that had little in common with its European counterparts. When Portuguese explorers finally made contact with the Ethiopian king in the 15th century, they immediately recognised the similarities to the legend of Prester John. The king was a powerful Christian ruler who lived in a remote and mysterious land, and he was a long-lost ally in the fight against a hostile world. The fact that the name Prester John was a mix of the title priest-king, which the Ethiopian rulers often used, and the name Johannes, a common name in the region, only served to cement the connection. Historians still argue whether the legend originated in Asia and then was later projected onto Ethiopia, or if it was the other way around. The truth is probably that the legend of Prester John was a kind of historical composite, a story that was so compelling that it was attached to every distant Christian kingdom that was found. The legend of a distant, powerful Christian king was a powerful narrative that fulfilled a deep need in the medieval European psyche. It was a kind of psychological security blanket, a belief that they were not alone in the world and that there were other Christians out there who were just as powerful and just as dedicated to the faith. The fact that the legend of Prester John was based on a real person, or at least a real historical event, is a powerful reminder of how a simple truth can be so completely distorted by the passage of time and the filter of cultural bias. The Europeans were looking for a king from a fairy tale, and what they found was a powerful ruler who was just as human and just as complex as they were. The story of Prester John is not a story about a myth, it is a story about a journey to find a truth that was so much more interesting than the legend that was created around it. So you stand there, in the bustling market, listening to the story of Prester John. The merchant is weaving a grand tale, a story of a magical king and a kingdom of unimaginable wealth. But you know the truth now. You know that the real story is not about magic and wealth, but about a distant battle, a powerful ruler, and a people who were just as human and just as fallible as everyone else. The myth of Prester John was a beautiful lie, but the truth, the real-life historical truth, is so much more compelling. It's a testament to the power of a good story, a story so powerful that it was able to cross continents and centuries and still have a kernel of truth at its heart. You've left the bustling market and the ghosts of mythical kings behind, and now you're standing in a quiet, secluded stone workshop. The air is heavy with the scent of herbs, sulphur, and the cool, metallic tang of an alchemist's lab. Shelves are lined with strange-looking glassware, bubbling concoctions and dusty tomes filled with arcane symbols. In the corner, a figure hunches over a furnace, its face illuminated by the dancing flames. This is not a wizard, but a medieval scholar, a master of a discipline that was once considered magic, but is now a cornerstone of modern science. For centuries, the figure of the medieval alchemist or mage was relegated to the realm of fiction, a mystical figure who spoke in riddles, performed impossible feats, and was in league with spirits. We've always been told that this was a period of scientific stagnation, a dark age where superstition reigned and reason was a forgotten art. But what if the truth was far more complex? What if the magic of these mages was just their own unique way of describing an advanced, if misunderstood, form of scientific inquiry? The mainstream historical fact is that the Middle Ages were a time of great intellectual curiosity. While the scientific method as we know it today was still centuries away, scholars were obsessed with understanding the world around them. They sought to find a unified theory of everything, a grand equation that would explain the natural world, from the movement of the planets to the transmutation of metals. They called this pursuit alchemy, a word that has since become synonymous with a fool's quest to turn lead into gold. But the reality was far more interesting. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that many of the so-called magical feats performed by medieval alchemists were, in fact, incredibly sophisticated scientific experiments. They were the world's first chemists, metallurgists, and pharmacists, and they were working with a body of knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time. Take, for example, the use of mercury. Alchemists were obsessed with mercury, or quicksilver, as it was called, a strange liquid metal that they believed held the key to immortality. They didn't know that mercury was a deadly poison. They did know, however, that it had a powerful and strange effect on other metals. By mixing mercury with gold, for example, they could create an amalgam that could be used to gild objects. This was a sophisticated chemical process that was used to create everything from jewellery to religious icons. The magical effect was just a chemical reaction. Another example is the search for the Philosopher's Stone, a mythical substance that was said to be able to turn base metals into gold. While the quest for the stone was, in a sense, a fool's errand, it led to some incredible discoveries. In their attempts to create the stone, alchemists created new chemical compounds, discovered new elements, and developed new techniques for distillation and purification. The search for the Philosopher's Stone was not a search for magic. It was a search for a better understanding of the natural world. It was a kind of scientific R&D project, a multi-century effort to unlock the secrets of matter. It was a failed quest for gold that led to a treasure trove of scientific knowledge. Historians still argue whether the alchemists believed they were practicing magic, or if they were just using the language of magic to describe a scientific process that was simply too complex for the general public to understand. Was their mystical language a way of protecting their secrets? Or was it a genuine belief that they were tapping into a spiritual power? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The lines between science and religion were blurry at the time, and it's likely that a scholar could believe in both. The medieval mage was a person who could perform a chemical reaction and believed that it was a divine act. They were a bridge between two worlds, the world of faith and the world of science. The discovery of the real-life work of these alchemists has completely changed our understanding of the Middle Ages. We now know that the period was not a time of scientific stagnation, but a time of incredible intellectual ferment. The alchemists were not just bumbling fools in search of a fantasy. They were brilliant, dedicated scholars who were laying the groundwork for modern chemistry. The magic they performed was not about spells and incantations. It was about the careful observation of the natural world, the meticulous measurement of chemical reactions, and the patient pursuit of knowledge. It was a kind of proto-scientific method, 1,000 years before the term was even invented. The story of the medieval mage is a powerful reminder that our perception of the past is often coloured by our own biases. We tend to see the past as a simpler, more primitive version of our own world, a place where people were ignorant and superstitious. But the truth is, the people of the Middle Ages were just as curious, just as intelligent, and just as capable of complex thought as we are. They just had a different way of describing the world. Their magic was our science, and their spells were our equations. It's a testament to the fact that human curiosity is a constant, and that even in the darkest of ages the light of knowledge can still shine brightly. So as you stand in the quiet workshop, the bubbling concoctions and the strange metallic smells filling the air, you feel a kind of gentle respect. You're not in the workshop of a wizard, you're in the lab of a brilliant scientist. The whispers of the flames, the soft clinking of the glass, the quiet hum of the furnace, they don't sound like magic. They sound like discovery. They sound like the slow, patient work of a man who was trying to understand the world, one crucible at a time. And you realise that sometimes the greatest magic is just a good, solid scientific fact. You've left the alchemist's lab and the scent of chemical wonders, and now you're standing on a windswept hill in the green rolling landscape of post-Roman Britain. The air is damp and cool, and the sound of a lone raven calling from a distant crag is the only sound. In the valley below, you can see the faint, overgrown traces of a fortified settlement. For centuries, the figure of King Arthur was a myth, a legend, a fictional hero of chivalry and magic who, along with his Knights of the Round Table, defended Britain from Saxon invaders. He was the subject of countless poems, romances and films, a symbol of a golden age that never was. He was a beautiful lie, a story so perfect and so powerful that we didn't want to believe it was just a story. But what if Arthur was in fact a real person, and the legend of his kingdom was a heavily romanticised account of a real historical event? The mainstream historical fact is that the story of King Arthur first appeared in the 9th century Welsh text, Historia Brittonum, and was later popularised by the 12th century historian Geoffrey of Monmouth. His account, Historia Regum Britannia, was a massive success, and gave us most of the Arthurian legends we know today, including the wizard Merlin, the sword Excalibur, and the Knights of the Round Table. For a long time, these stories were considered pure fiction, a creative blend of Welsh folklore and a desire to create a heroic national origin story for the British people. The idea that a single, powerful king could have united the various Celtic kingdoms and defeated the Saxons was seen as a historical impossibility. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that in the last few decades, a growing number of archaeologists and historians have begun to argue that the legend of King Arthur is based on a real-life figure. This Arthur, however, was not a king in a shining suit of armour, but a post-Roman Romano-British warlord, or Dux Bellorum, leader of battles. He was a military leader who, in the chaotic years after the Roman withdrawal from Britain in 410 AD, organised a desperate resistance against the invading Saxons. The most compelling evidence for this is a reference in the 6th century text, the Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, written by the monk Gildas. Gildas, who was not a fan of the British leaders, mentions a major battle at a place called Mount Badon, where the Britons won a decisive victory. He doesn't name Arthur, but he describes the battle as a huge turning point, a victory that gave the Britons a generation of peace. The Arthurian legend later attached Arthur's name to this battle. The most compelling archaeological evidence for a historical Arthur comes from a place called Cadbury Castle in Somerset, which many scholars believe to be the location of the legendary Camelot. Excavations in the 1960s and 70s revealed that the hill fort was extensively refortified and reoccupied in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, a period that corresponds with the timeline of the historical Arthur. The excavations revealed a massive hall and a series of fortifications that were unlike any other British structure of the time. It was a place of power, a place where a powerful leader could have ruled. While no evidence of a King Arthur was found, the size and scope of the settlement suggest that it was the seat of a powerful warlord. Historians still argue whether the historical Arthur was a single person or a composite of several different leaders. Was he a single figure who led a united army, or was he a kind of historical archetype, a hero who embodied the collective spirit of the British resistance? The jury is still out. But the fact remains that the legend of King Arthur, which was once considered pure fiction, is now seen as a heavily romanticised account of a very real and very important period of British history. The legend was a kind of historical memory, a story that was told and retold, with each retelling adding a new layer of magic and myth, but with a kernel of truth at its heart. The story of the real King Arthur is a powerful reminder that history is often a game of telephone. A real person, a real event, can be so transformed by the passage of time and the desire for a good story that the truth is almost completely lost. But if you look closely enough, if you're willing to dig into the archaeological record and read between the lines of the ancient texts, you can still find the ghost of the real story. The Arthur we know from legend, the king in the shining armour, the perfect knight, is a beautiful lie. But the Arthur who really existed, the grizzled warlord fighting a desperate losing battle against a ruthless invader, is a hero who is so much more human and so much more compelling. So as you stand on the hill, looking down at the overgrown remains of a long-lost fortress, you feel a new sense of connection to the past. This isn't just a place from a storybook, it's a real place, where real people lived and fought and died. The whispers of the wind feel like the echoes of 1,000 years, carrying with them the sound of a forgotten battle, the clash of swords, and the cries of a people who are fighting for their lives. And you realise that sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones from the stories, but the ones who lived and breathed and fought in the real world. They are the ones who created the legends, and in a way, they are the ones who are still waiting to be found. You've left the windswept hills of Britain and the ghostly fortress of King Arthur behind, and now you are standing in a different kind of green, a hot, humid, and impossibly dense jungle. The air is thick with the scent of decay and life, and the sound of the Amazonian rainforest is a deafening orchestra of unseen creatures. For centuries, this jungle was a vast, terrifying blank space on the map, a place where explorers and adventurers went to disappear. And for just as long, the myth of the lost city of Z persisted. It was the white whale of exploration, a city supposedly founded by European refugees, a place of immense wealth and advanced civilization that lay hidden somewhere in the impenetrable interior of the Amazon. It was the obsession of a British explorer named Percy Fawcett, who in 1925 vanished while searching for it, taking the myth with him. We've always been told that this was the ultimate tale of hubris, a man who, in his desperate search for a fantasy, simply got lost in a jungle that was far too big for him. But what if the fantasy wasn't a fantasy at all? What if the lost city of Z and the advanced civilization it represented was a truth that was simply too unbelievable for us to accept? The mainstream historical fact is that the Amazon was considered an empty, primordial wilderness, a place where nomadic, small-scale societies lived in harmony with nature, but a place that was simply incapable of supporting a large urbanized civilization. The sheer difficulty of agriculture, the lack of domesticated animals, and the constant threat of disease made the idea of a large city in the Amazon seem like a historical impossibility. The myth of the lost city of Z was seen as a relic of a colonial mindset, a desire to believe that European-style civilization could somehow exist in a place where it was simply not meant to be. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the idea of a lost Amazonian civilization was a truth that was simply waiting for the right technology to be discovered. The Amazon, it turns out, was not the empty wilderness we thought it was. It was a landscape that had been terraformed and engineered by a long-lost civilization that was far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. The evidence for this comes from two incredible pieces of technology: LIDAR, light detection and ranging, and satellite imagery. When used to scan the ground beneath the dense canopy of the Amazon, these technologies have revealed a startling new picture of the past. They have revealed the ghost of an ancient civilization, a network of geometrically perfect earthworks, villages, and even a system of raised causeways and canals that were used for agriculture and transportation. These are not the work of a few small-scale societies. These are the remnants of a large, complex, and highly organized civilization. One of the most compelling examples of this is the network of settlements discovered in the state of Acre, Brazil. LIDAR scans have revealed a series of geometric patterns, squares, circles, and intricate designs that were carved into the earth. These were not just artistic flourishes. They were the remnants of a complex society that had a deep understanding of urban planning and a mastery of the natural landscape. The most startling discovery, however, was the network of roads and canals that connected these settlements. They were not random tracks. They were a meticulously planned transportation system that allowed the civilization to move goods and people across a vast, watery landscape. This was a truth that was simply too big to be discovered by traditional archaeology, a truth that was completely hidden by the dense foliage of the jungle. Historians still argue whether this civilization was a single empire or a confederation of different tribes. Was it a single, unified state, or was it a network of interconnected city-states, each with its own unique culture and traditions? The jury is still out, but the fact remains that the Amazon was not the empty wilderness we thought it was. It was a place that was home to a massive, complex, and highly organized civilization that existed for centuries before it was wiped out by the arrival of European diseases. The story of the lost city of Z was a myth that was proven true, but the city itself was a ghost, a remnant of a civilization that was lost not to the jungle, but to history. The story of the lost city of Z is a powerful reminder that our perception of the past is often limited by the technology we have at our disposal. For centuries, we were looking at the Amazon with our eyes, and all we could see was a green wall of trees. But when we used a new set of tools, when we were willing to look with a different kind of vision, we found a truth that was far more incredible than any myth. We found a civilization that was not lost to the jungle, but a civilization that was simply invisible to us, a truth that was hidden in plain sight. So as you stand in the humid, buzzing heart of the Amazon, you feel a new sense of reverence for the past. The jungle is no longer a blank space on the map. It is a living, breathing library of a long-lost history, a place where the ghosts of a forgotten civilization are still waiting to be found. The whispers of the wind through the leaves feel a little different now, a little more like a secret language, a kind of ancient history that we're only just beginning to learn to read, and you realize that sometimes the greatest discoveries are not the ones that we make, but the ones that have been waiting for us all along. You've left the humid embrace of the Amazon and the ghosts of its lost civilization, and now you're standing in a quiet, cool crypt beneath a medieval church in rural France. The air is still, heavy with the scent of damp stone and a history that feels both ancient and very much alive. The light from your lantern casts long, dancing shadows on the walls, revealing strange symbols and intricate carvings that feel both familiar and deeply mysterious. For centuries, the legend of the Knights Templar has been one of the most enduring and romantic in history, a monastic military order founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims to the Holy Land. They became one of the most powerful and secretive organisations in Europe, amassing incredible wealth and influence. And when they were suddenly and brutally suppressed by King Philip IV of France in 1307, the story was that their vast treasure, the wealth of a kingdom, a trove of gold, jewels and religious relics, simply vanished. It was a ghost story with a body count, a myth that fueled countless treasure hunts and conspiracy theories for hundreds of years. We've always been told that the treasure was a myth, a piece of romantic fiction that was created to explain the sudden disappearance of the Order's incredible wealth. But what if the treasure wasn't a myth at all? What if it was just a truth that was hidden in plain sight? A truth that was a little less about gold and a lot more about something far more valuable? The mainstream historical fact is that on Friday, October the 13th, 1307, King Philip IV, in a move that was both stunningly abrupt and politically motivated, ordered the arrest of every Templar knight in France. He accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and a laundry list of other crimes. The Templars were tortured into confessing, and in 1314, their Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake. The king, who was deeply in debt to the order, seized all of their assets. But a curious thing happened. The king's men never found the full extent of the Templar treasury. The legend was that the Templars, warned of the coming arrests, had spirited their treasure away, hiding it in a secret location. This was the birth of the myth, a story of a hidden fortune that was protected by a curse. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the Templar treasure wasn't gold and jewels at all. It was something far more powerful, knowledge. The Templars were not just soldiers, they were bankers, merchants, and engineers. They created a system of proto-banking that was centuries ahead of its time, allowing pilgrims and merchants to deposit money in one Templar house and withdraw it from another using a system of coded documents. This was a revolutionary concept, and it gave the Templars an incredible amount of financial power. The real treasure was this knowledge, this financial system, and the documents that supported it. It was a kind of ghost money, a wealth that existed not in physical form, but in the form of a promise, a piece of paper. The most compelling evidence for this comes from a startling discovery in the last few decades. In a quiet, rural village in Portugal, a team of historians found a buried cache of what appeared to be Templar-era documents. They were not official documents, but were a series of ledgers, receipts, and coded messages that had been hidden away for centuries. They were a kind of ghost ledger, a secret accounting system that the Templars used to track their vast financial empire. The documents revealed that the Templars were not just bankers, but they were also master spies, with a vast network of informers and agents who were working to undermine the power of their enemies. The treasure wasn't a pile of gold. It was a vast and complex network of information, a secret society that was, in its own way, more powerful than any kingdom. Historians still argue whether the treasure was a mix of both physical wealth and knowledge. Was the gold hidden away to be used to fund a later Templar resurgence, or was it simply a distraction, a red herring that was used to protect the Templars' most valuable asset, their knowledge? The answer is probably a mix of both. The Templars were masters of deception, and it's likely that they would have used every tool at their disposal to protect themselves and their wealth. The myth of a cursed treasure was a clever way of keeping people from looking for the real one. It was a kind of psychological fence, a way of protecting a valuable resource without putting up a physical barrier. The story of the Templar treasure is a powerful reminder that our perception of wealth is often limited by our own biases. We tend to think of wealth in terms of gold and jewels, but the Templars understood that real power lies in knowledge, in information, and in the ability to control the flow of money. Their treasure wasn't something that you could hold in your hand. It was a kind of ghost, a powerful and invisible force that was just as valuable as any amount of gold. And it was a truth that was simply too complex and too abstract for a king to understand. So as you stand in the quiet crypt, the echoes of your footsteps alonely sound. You feel a new sense of reverence for the past. The Templars were not just soldiers, they were brilliant innovators, and their treasure was a testament to their genius. The whispers of the wind through the cracks in the stone feel a little different now, a little more like a secret language, a kind of ancient accounting system that we are only just beginning to learn to read. and you realize that sometimes the greatest treasures are not the ones that we find, but the ones that have been waiting for us all along, hidden in plain sight. You've emerged from the cool, silent crypts of Europe and are now standing in a dense, sun-dappled forest on the banks of the mighty Amazon River. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the constant rhythmic hum of unseen insects. The world around you feels vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the quiet history you've just left behind. For centuries, European explorers and chroniclers told stories of a race of fierce, warlike women who lived deep within the Amazon rainforest, a tribe of female warriors who had no men in their society, who fought with bows and arrows, and who were a terrifying and beautiful sight to behold. These stories, which were often tied to the Greek myth of the Amazons, were widely dismissed as romantic fiction. We've always been told that these were just the fantasies of men who had spent too long in the wilderness, tales born from a combination of a desire for adventure and a lack of understanding of a truly alien culture. But what if the myth was not a complete lie? What if the Amazonian warriors were in fact a real historical fact, a truth that was simply too unbelievable for us to accept? The mainstream historical fact is that the legend of the Amazons was first recorded by the Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana in 1541. He and his men were the first Europeans to explore the Amazon River, and they returned with incredible tales of a powerful race of female warriors. They claimed that these women lived in a large urbanized society, that they fought with a ferocity that was unmatched, and that they had no men in their society. The stories were dismissed as fanciful tales, and the river was named the Amazon, after the mythical Greek tribe. The idea of a matriarchal warrior society was simply too far-fetched for most academics to believe. We were taught that the Amazon was a world of small nomadic tribes, and the idea of a large, organised and female-led society was a historical impossibility. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that in the last few decades, a growing number of archaeologists and historians have begun to argue that the stories of the Amazonian warriors were based on a very real and very powerful historical figure, the female shaman or medicine woman of many of the Amazonian tribes. These women were not just spiritual leaders, they were also powerful political figures, military strategists, and healers. They were revered for their knowledge of the natural world and their ability to communicate with the spirits. They were the ones who led their tribes into battle, and they were the ones who made the most important decisions for their people. The warriors the Spanish saw were not a separate tribe of women, but a powerful and respected class of female leaders who were the heart of their society. The most compelling evidence for this comes from a startling discovery in 2005. A team of archaeologists excavating a burial site in a remote part of the Amazon discovered the remains of a number of women who had been buried with weapons, a finding that was highly unusual for the time. The skeletons showed signs of extreme physical exertion and a number of battle-related injuries. But the most shocking discovery was the fact that many of the women had been buried with a number of ritualistic objects, including shamanic masks, ceremonial rattles, and other objects that were used in religious ceremonies. This was not the burial site of a race of mythical warriors. It was the burial site of a powerful and respected class of female shaman warriors. They were both the spiritual and the military leaders of their society. Historians still argue whether the Amazonian warriors were a single unified group, or if they were a class of powerful women who were found in different tribes throughout the region. Was it a single race of female warriors, or was it a widespread cultural phenomenon, a kind of Amazonian sisterhood that was a central part of their society? The jury is still out. But the fact remains that the stories of the Amazonian warriors, which were once considered a myth, are now seen as a heavily distorted but ultimately accurate account of a real historical fact. The Spanish, who were used to a patriarchal society, could not comprehend the idea of a female-led society, and so they interpreted what they saw through the lens of their own culture, turning a powerful class of female leaders into a mythic race of Amazons. The story of the Amazonian warriors is a powerful reminder that history is often a game of interpretation. We tend to see the past through the lens of our own culture, and in doing so, we often miss the most important and most interesting truths. The Spanish were looking for a mythical race of female warriors, and what they found was a powerful and respected class of female leaders who were a central part of their society. The myth was a lie, but the truth, the real-life, historical truth, is so much more compelling. It's a testament to the power of a good story, a story that was able to cross continents and centuries and still have a kernel of truth at its heart. So as you stand in the humid, buzzing heart of the Amazon, you feel a new sense of reverence for the past. The stories of the Amazonian warriors are no longer a myth. They are a truth, a powerful and humbling reminder that the world is a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than we ever thought possible. The whispers of the wind through the leaves feel a little different now, a little more like the echoes of 1,000 years, a kind of ancient history that we are only just beginning to learn to read. And you realise that sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones from the stories, but the ones who lived and breathed and fought in the real world. They are the ones who created the legends, and in a way, they are the ones who are still waiting to be found. You've stepped out of the humid, insect-filled embrace of the Amazon and into a cold, mist-shrouded forest in the mountains of south-central France. The air is crisp and clean, and the only sound is the rustling of the leaves and the distant, unsettling howl of the wind. This is the region of Gévaudan, a place that, in the mid-18th century, was home to a terrifying historical mystery, the Beast of Gévaudan. For 3 years, from 1764 to 1767, this creature was said to have killed over 100 people, most of them women and children. The descriptions were chilling and consistent. A creature of monstrous size, with a shaggy red coat, a long pointed snout and a mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth. It was a kind of historical ghost story, a tale that was so terrifying and so consistent that it was, for a long time, believed to be the work of a supernatural monster, a wolf from hell. But what if the beast wasn't a myth at all? What if it was a very real, very terrifying animal that was simply too bizarre for the people of the time to understand? The mainstream historical fact is that the attacks were very real. The reports of the killings, the descriptions of the victims, and the desperate attempts of the French government to stop the creature are all well documented. The king himself, Louis XV, sent a team of elite wolf hunters to the region, and a huge bounty was placed on the beast's head. But every time a wolf was killed, the attacks would resume, often with a new wave of ferocity. The people of Gévaudan, who were deeply religious and deeply superstitious, began to believe that the creature was not a natural animal at all, but a kind of demonic wolf, a punishment from God. The story of the beast was a myth that was built on a very real foundation of terror and death. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the beast was likely not a wolf at all. The descriptions of the creature, which were often inconsistent with the physical characteristics of a normal wolf, led a number of naturalists and historians to believe that it was something else entirely. The most compelling theory, and the one that is gaining more and more traction, is that the beast was a highly trained, semi-domesticated animal, a kind of wolf-dog hybrid that had been intentionally bred and trained to be a killer. The reports of the beast's behaviour, its ability to walk on its hind legs, its apparent indifference to human presence, and its uncanny ability to evade hunters, all point to a creature that was not a wild animal, but a kind of pet. The most compelling evidence for this comes from the testimony of one of the survivors of the attacks, a young girl who, in a sworn statement, claimed that the beast had been accompanied by a man. The man, she said, was dressed in a distinctive red coat, and he was the one who'd commanded the beast to attack. This testimony, which was dismissed at the time as the ramblings of a traumatized child, is now seen as a key piece of the puzzle. It suggests that the beast was not a lone monster, but a kind of weapon, a tool that was being used by a human being to commit a series of heinous crimes. The fact that the attack stopped abruptly after the death of the Marquis de Morangies, a local nobleman who was rumoured to have a strange fascination with wolves, only adds more fuel to the fire. Historians still argue whether the beast was a single creature or a pack of animals. Was it a single wolf-dog hybrid, or was it a pack of animals that were being used by a human being? The jury is still out, but the fact remains that the Beast of Gévaudan, which was once considered a myth, is now seen as a heavily distorted but ultimately accurate account of a very real historical fact. The people of Gévaudan were not wrong to be terrified. They were just wrong about what they were afraid of. The monster was not a supernatural creature, but a human being who was using an animal to commit a series of crimes. The story of the Beast of Gévaudan is a powerful reminder that history is often a game of interpretation. We tend to see the past through the lens of our own culture, and in doing so, we often miss the most important and most interesting truths. The people of Gévaudan were looking for a supernatural explanation for a series of events that were simply too terrifying for them to comprehend. And in doing so, they created a myth that was more powerful, and in a way, more terrifying, than the truth. So as you stand in the cold, misty forest, you feel a new sense of reverence for the past. The stories of the Beast of Gévaudan are no longer a myth. They are a truth, a powerful and humbling reminder that the world is a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than we ever thought possible. The whispers of the wind through the trees feel a little different now, a little more like a secret language, a kind of ancient history that we are only just beginning to learn to read. And you realise that sometimes the greatest monsters are not the ones from the stories, but the ones who lived and breathed and fought in the real world. They are the ones who created the legends, and in a way they are the ones who are still waiting to be found. You've left the dark, misty forests of Gévaudan and the chilling mystery of its beast, and now you are standing in a warm, lush, sun-drenched landscape. The air is thick with the scent of tropical flowers and the sound of birdsong. A clear, sparkling spring bubbles up from the ground, its water so pure and inviting you can almost feel its healing power from a distance. For centuries, the story of the Fountain of Youth was one of the most persistent and romantic myths in history. It was the obsession of explorers from every nation, a magical spring that was said to reverse the aging process, restore health, and even grant immortality. It was the reason that the Spanish conquistador Ponce de Leon, in his desperate quest for this mythical water, famously searched the jungles and swamps of what is now Florida. We've always been told that this was a fool's errand, a quest for a fantasy that was born from a combination of ancient folklore and a deep-seated human desire to cheat death. But what if the fountain wasn't a myth at all? What if it was a very real, very powerful natural phenomenon that was simply too miraculous for the people of the time to understand? The mainstream historical fact is that the myth of the Fountain of Youth has been a part of human folklore for thousands of years. From ancient Greece to medieval Japan, stories of magical, rejuvenating waters have been a part of a global tradition. In the Western world, the myth was often tied to the lost city of Atlantis, or to the fabled land of Prester John. It was a kind of holy grail, a magical prize that lay just beyond the next horizon, a hope that was powerful enough to drive men to the ends of the earth. But the search, of course, was always a failure. There was no single spring that could turn back the clock, and the quest for the fountain was always seen as a testament to human gullibility. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the search for the Fountain of Youth was not a search for magic. It was a search for a very real and very powerful natural substance. The most compelling candidate for the real-life Fountain of Youth is a specific kind of mineral spring that is rich in a substance that was, for a long time, dismissed as a strange curiosity: lithium. Lithium, as we know today, is a powerful mood stabilizer and is used to treat a number of mental health conditions, including bipolar disorder and depression. It's a kind of natural antidepressant, a mineral that can have a profound effect on the human brain. The Fountain of Youth was not about reversing the aging process. It was about reversing the mental and emotional decline that comes with it. The most compelling evidence for this comes from a startling discovery in the last few decades. In a number of locations that were once associated with the Fountain of Youth myth, from the hot springs of Florida to the mineral springs of the Carpathian Mountains, scientists have found that the water has an unusually high concentration of lithium. The people who bathed in these waters, who drank from them, and who lived near them would have experienced a profound change in their mood and their mental state. The water would have made them feel younger, more energetic and more optimistic. It would have made them feel like they were being reborn. The magic of the fountain was not in its ability to reverse the aging process. It was in its ability to make the people who drank from it feel like they were alive again. Historians still argue whether the stories of the Fountain of Youth were a direct result of the discovery of these lithium-rich springs, or if it was simply a happy coincidence. Was the myth a conscious exaggeration of a real-life phenomenon, or was it a story that was so powerful that it was attached to every spring that had a positive effect on the human body? The jury is still out. But the fact remains that the search for the Fountain of Youth was a search for a very real and very powerful natural substance. The explorers who were searching for it were not crazy. They were just looking for the right thing in the wrong way. They were looking for magic when they should have been looking for science. The story of the Fountain of Youth is a powerful reminder that our perception of magic is often limited by our own biases. We tend to think of magic in terms of spells and incantations, but the people of the past understood that magic was simply a word for something that was too powerful and too mysterious for them to understand. The Fountain of Youth was not a myth. It was a truth, a powerful and humbling reminder that the world is a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than we ever thought possible. The whispers of the wind through the leaves feel a little different now, a little more like a secret language, a kind of ancient history that we're only just beginning to learn to read. And so, you have come to the end of our journey. We've walked through ancient forests, sailed across stormy seas, and delved into quiet crypts. We've seen how the maps of a forgotten past were not just a fantasy, but an echo of a lost knowledge. We've learned that the secret Roman roads were not lost, but simply hidden in plain sight. We've found the real-life origins of the lost colony of Roanoke and the lost city of Atlantis. We've discovered that the beasts of legend were just the ghosts of a prehistoric world. We've found the ghost of the unicorn and the real-life giants of folklore. We've seen that the mythical king, Prester John, was a real person, and that the mages of the Middle Ages were the world's first scientists. We've walked through the ghost of King Arthur's kingdom and the lost city of Zed. We've found the true nature of the Templar treasure and the truth behind the Amazonian warriors. And finally, we've come to the end of our journey, a place where the search for a mythical fountain was a search for a very real and very powerful natural truth. The journey is over now, but the wonder remains. The world is a place that is still full of mysteries, a place where the line between fact and fiction is a lot more blurry than we ever thought possible. The stories we tell, the myths we hold dear, are not just a collection of lies. They're a kind of historical memory, a truth that has been transformed by the passage of time and the desire for a good story. They are a kind of ghost, a powerful and invisible force that is still waiting to be found. And in a way, they are a promise that the world is a lot more interesting and a lot more magical than we ever thought possible. The quiet air of your room has softened now. The fan, if you've had it on, seems to slow, its hum becoming a gentle lullaby. The ancient stories we've explored together tonight are not just facts and dates, but whispers from the past, each one a thread in the vast complex tapestry of human history. The world you inhabit now is the culmination of all those forgotten truths, a place where the ghosts of giants and the spirits of lost civilizations have all contributed to the landscape. There's no need to hold on to the last images, just let them fade. Let the stories of ancient roads and mythical beasts dissolve into the comfortable darkness. Your mind is quiet now, the frantic search for a truth at an end. Just let yourself sink into the soft pillows and know that even the most incredible stories often have a quiet, humble truth at their heart waiting for you to find it. Now, breathe, let go,